Language is often seen as merely the optimal form of communication. There is the belief that its only goal is to transmit information and that's all it should ever be. And to an extent, that's true. However, by observing each individual approach to communication in various societies, we can find so much about its roots, its cultural implications, and even its future. My name is Alex Chin, and today I present my answer to the question, what happens when a culture's language goes extinct? But first of all, let's understand why a language might go extinct. From around the globe, the most common victims of language loss are relatively isolated indigenous communities who have had a stronger colonial power take over. We see this in the entirety of North and South America after the colonial era, Australia and other island nations from Britain's sprawling empire, and even debatably Latin from the influence of conquering Germanic nations that imposed their own influences. In essence, the language dies because that is what is most beneficial to the inhabitants. We must go back to the original intent of language, to communicate. If abandoning your language means that you can communicate with the colonizers who are often more powerful, then these languages tend to be left to die. Sometimes this is voluntary. For example, Welsh faded out of use in the 19th century in favor of English, simply because it was associated with better economic opportunities. However, in the case of Canada, these languages were instead ripped away by the government through residential schools. Now, if it was merely the traditional form of communication that was lost, it wouldn't really be so bad. It would undeniably be convenient if everyone on Earth spoke the same language. To truly explain what happens when a culture's language goes extinct, it's extremely important to understand the differences between languages go far beyond different characters, spellings, and pronunciations. They embody that culture's concepts and needs. Let's introduce the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. This hypothesis is that language affects how people think. Sapir believed that he needed to learn the language of the culture to understand the worldview of his speakers. For example, English has a lot of words to describe types of computers: laptop, PC, television, tablet, etc. This is because computers are very important to the modern English-speaking peoples. The language of Pacific tribes plays similar importance in the naming of fish, with over 1,000 species being named and most having their biology, behavior, and habitat understood completely. We see that languages shape themselves to the needs of the speakers. There are other interesting examples. In some languages, such as Guyu Nimsa in Australia or Tistal in the Mayan region of Central America, there is a near complete absence of the concept of left and right. Everything is described with cardinal directions like north or east. This is mostly found in indigenous tribes with no large interior spaces that may obscure cardinal directions through the sun, leading to a system that was more useful to them. Different languages provide different perspectives into the world. For example, in one indigenous language, the word my cannot be put in front of an object from the natural world. It can only be put in front of a person. For example, my mom. It does not signify possession, but rather a deep personal connection. It can be argued that as much as the needs of the people shape the language can then shape the people in return. I speak Mandarin, and the word teacher contains a character for old, since teachers were traditionally old and wise. This is one of the ways children are taught to have respect for teachers within this culture, by simply learning the language. In the aforementioned indigenous language, water was from the root word to ask. This meant water commanded a sort of respectful request to be able to use it, and this respect for the environment is then passed down from generation to generation. As language is cross-linked and unavoidably bound to culture like this, destroying the language means destruction of much of the culture. While traditions can be remembered, much of the hidden subtext and way of seeing the world can no longer be replicated. Aside from this loss of perspective, there is also just a practical side of information transfer. Losing a language means losing all the stories, history, and knowledge within that culture that was passed down by that language. Within indigenous societies, oral history is one of the primary methods of passing down generational knowledge. Without this generational knowledge, people struggle to understand the environment they live in. This knowledge may even be unique to that indigenous language, such as the names and functions of certain newly discovered medicinal plants that is otherwise not yet understood very well by foreigners. Even if there is a pre-existing medical consensus, the anecdotal stories and history of using these plants provides an extremely valuable pool of data and practical application that is hard to come by with experimental models. Now that the importance of each and every language to the inhabitants has been established, we can quite easily make the jump to a desire to revive a dead language to regain back some of that culture long lost. Perhaps the most famous example of language revival in North America is Pentlatch. Pentlatch was deemed extinct in the 1940s. It's spoken exclusively by the Qualicum First Nation on Vancouver Island with only 128 members currently, making it very vulnerable in accordance with the patterns we established above, limited in speakers and taken over by a colonial force. Chief Ricamo started revitalization efforts in 2017, and it was completed in 2023. Documents and recordings that were made before the 1940s were used to reconstruct grammar and vocabulary, and revitalization was made easier by the fact that the language was very similar to Hokaminam and Ayajutham, two languages that are in danger of extinction. To make this admirable effort, the chief worked together with the First Peoples Cultural Council, the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, and the First Peoples Cultural Foundation to pave the road ahead for revivals of other languages in the same way. Mi'kmaq. This language was originally spoken in Mi'kmaq, or the territory encompassing New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and the eastern tip of Quebec. It never truly died but was struggling due to a gap generation where people did not learn the language due to residential schools. This was the earliest colonized area of Canada, and the longest under the Europeans' rule before the fall of the schools. Revitalizing the language was difficult after the damage done by the residential schools. Parents could not teach the language to their children, and learning the language in school made it too formal and non-immersive. To solve this, the community focused on immersion, with signs written in Mi'kmaq within the community and public announcements made in English and Mi'kmaq. This was effective, as rather than dying like it was before, the gap generation has been crossed over and the number of speakers has increased by 5.9% from 2016. The Kantamanka Mi'kmaq Fluency Project started in January of 2024. Mi'kmaq. This language is spoken by the Métis people, and originated from the mixing of Cree and French in the 19th century. It is different from the other two languages due to it being a sort of mixed language. Mi'kmaq exists on some sort of scale, where some areas may incorporate more French or more Cree than others. It has no standardized spelling system. Instead, it is traditionally only a spoken language like many other indigenous languages. Coming up with a standard for restoration is difficult due to the large number of regional dialects and differences, leading into that scale I talked about earlier. The BC Métis Federation is collaborating with Heritage Canada for the revitalization of our Mi'kmaq language project, with funding of $5.3 million. Currently, Mi'kmaq is still critically endangered, with less than 1,000 fluent speakers. As much as language is a tool of communication, it is just as reflective of what the society requires to be communicated. Looking deeper into these languages reveals major factors in how cultural beliefs and values get passed down from generation to generation, and shows just how devastating loss of language can be to these cultural groups. Canada recognizes this issue, and is doing its part to support Indigenous languages. Budget 2019 included an investment of $333.7 million over 5 years, with an annual budget of $115.7 million afterwards to support Indigenous language community-based projects. Overall, the revitalization of Pentlatch and other languages bodes well for the future. Thank you and goodbye.